Okay, today I'm delighted to be joined by Georgia Hall, who's the ESG and Investment Director at Maple-Brown Abbott Global Listed Infrastructure. So welcome to the podcast, Georgia.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
And I had to Google what global listed infrastructure was, but basically we're talking about large infrastructure systems like energy systems, water treatment and things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, so the team that I work on invests in the listed markets, and we focus on purely on infrastructure companies. So, as you say, electric and water utilities, renewable energy developers, transportation infrastructure, and things like cell phone towers.
Right, fantastic. I always like to clear up the jargon myself, if nothing else. I'll start with the first question I ask everybody who joins us on the pod, and that's how did you first get started in ESG investing?
Yeah, so I suppose I sort of formalized into an ESG role 9 years ago, which it doesn't make me a unicorn with decades of experience, but it does give me a reasonable amount of time sort of dedicated to sort of sustainability and ESG. My background has always been in the investment management industry. I suppose I pivoted more into the ESG side of things, as I said, 9 years ago, where I was more on the reporting side on behalf of working in sort of the sustainability reporting side for an investment manager. And then I did a 2-year stint at a very large bank based in Australia, and I worked on things like climate risk analysis, group-wide policy on things like human rights and tobacco and defence and lending to, in the energy sector. And then 5 years ago, I joined the company that I'm now at, which is Maple-Brown Abbott. And as you mentioned earlier, I work on an infrastructure investment team, and my role is around the integration of the environmental, social governance factors in the way that we make investment decisions. I might just really quickly add that as part of my reskilling process, I undertook a master's in human rights law and environmental law, which I absolutely loved as a mature student, that was a very rewarding experience.
Fantastic. And it obviously flows neatly on to ESG. Now, ESG is one of those phrases that gets bandied about a lot. But what does it really mean in practice?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, it's such a shame that ESG is just thrown around, in all manners in the press, by politicians and the like. The way it's thrown around is actually quite misleading, because the term ESG can mean a number of things. And I think one of the things that we have not done well on is we're just not specific in the way that when we say or use the phrase ESG. ESG obviously refers to environmental, social governance factors. There is a whole spectrum of ways that you can look at ESG in an investment process. So, for instance, you could have ethical or moral sort of positions on things like tobacco or alcohol or abortion, which means that you just simply don't want exposure to those types of investments, and therefore you want an exclusion in the investment process that doesn't give you any of that exposure. You could also have things like screens around, the extent to which you would be willing to have any kind of coal exposure in your investments. And when I say your investments, this could be your pension plan, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can have other things that are more like the integration of environmental, social governance factors, where the investment manager is looking at ways to drive investment opportunities, but also manage the risks associated with them. So, for instance, the investment opportunities associated with renewables, but then also mitigating or managing the risks associated with things like stranded assets, so assets that are written off well before their useful lifetime. And then you can have other things, which is like sort of the more impact or sustainable focus strategies, where the investment objective, the investment mandate, is to invest obviously with the purpose of achieving a financial return, but is also intermixed with achieving a certain environmental or social impact. Sometimes it can be a governance impact, but that's not very common. So what I'm trying to say is that as you can see, there is a whole range of different measures here, and so the term ESG is sort of thrown around in a bit of an unfair fashion, and it's also used interchangeably with climate change. It's also used interchangeably with sustainability and also responsible investment. And I think there's just, I suppose, there are nuances here. I might just also quickly add that I just hate acronyms altogether, because ESG is used frequently, but I think it's important to actually always spell it out, to say environmental, social, and governance characteristics, just as much as diversity, equity, and inclusion, as much as, if we talk about things like the Environmental Protection Agency, because I think that actually just gives meaning to what we're actually talking to, rather than just a throwaway acronym.
But are there any sort of industry set minimums, of what is or isn't ESG? If you had, I don't know, organically produced tobacco, and you've mentioned tobacco a couple of times, could that be an ESG investment because it's not using pesticides?
Yeah. So, look, one of the things I've learned through my career is that the challenge with this discussion is that a lot of morals and ethics come into it, and everyone's perspective on morals and ethics are different. And it's very hard to bring people together on topics that they fundamentally disagree with or view differently. And, ideally, you don't want to be imposing one view over the other, but what you do want to do is cater for people's individual needs as much as is practical. At a bank that I used to work with, one of the conundrums we had was we won't lend money to brothels, but what if they are legal brothels? And if they're legal, then why wouldn't you lend to them? And so this calls into the question around organic cannabis, because on the one hand, one might say, well, cannabis is a drug, but then on the other hand, it's being grown sustainably and without pesticides. So, I think herein lies one of the challenges with this space. But ESG fundamentally is more around the risk opportunity piece in an investment decision-making process, as opposed to morals and ethics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, and sorry, I didn't answer your question on the minimum standards. Wouldn't that be absolutely wonderful if there were minimum standards? Again, the challenge here is that I think it just goes back to my original point. How can you do that where everyone's perspectives are so different? And I think in the European Union, for instance, and also the UK, there have been attempts to try and standardize what might be considered an ESG investment strategy versus an impact or a sustainable investment strategy. The challenge is that it can sometimes feel like you're trying to fit a round peg in a square hole, or I can't remember which way that phrase goes, but you get the gist, is that you can be trying to force something into a box that probably can't be perfectly defined. And there's nothing wrong with that if you can't do that, because if the world agreed on investment styles and ways of investing, then there wouldn't be a market and an economy for it, and we wouldn't be differentiated. And the same goes for ESG.
Yeah. And what's the ESG market like, in terms of opportunity and risk? Is it much the same as investments in other, in standard infrastructure or other projects, or is it, do you have to play with sort of different criteria?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good question, because so much of this comes down to what the hell you're investing in the first place. Mm-hmm. If you're investing in global equities across all different sectors, then you'd be thinking about, the ESG factors, environmental, social, governance factors for tech stocks versus healthcare stocks. So healthcare stocks, it's about customer affordability, right? It's about ethical testing, or not using animal testing in the process, or like price gouging. In the technology space, perhaps like AI and privacy and data, and limiting child abuse material, or even around managing emissions associated with data centers. And then on the banks, for instance, like predatory lending, or lending to the fossil fuel or energy sector. So it is, it's a bit of a hodgepodge in terms of the way that you look at these things, but ultimately the investment strategy's purpose consistent way of measuring these factors in the way that an investment manager would invest. And I might just share my perspective on the infrastructure side. Because we invest in a very defined universe of companies, we could probably do away with the ESG label because it's inherent in everything that we do. And I'm not saying that just to be cute, but if you think about the water utilities in the UK and what's going on with them at the moment, so much of the risk at the moment is around environmental degradation. It's about combined sewage overflows. It's about focusing on governance and appropriate remuneration and corporate structures. In the electricity sector, it's about customer affordability. It's about also things like labour rights and health and safety. On the governance side, these infrastructure companies are investing in huge amounts of capex, much of which is actually ratepayers' money. And so investment decisions that are being made today can have ramifications for decades to come. And so governance is the pillar on which everything sits in the infrastructure space. And I don't think really anyone can argue with the fact that these are all major opportunity drivers, but then also risk mitigators in the investment space for infrastructure. Yeah.
So obviously, there's we talked about being bandied about a lot, and there's a lot of talk of an ESG backlash, and the whole sort of go woke, go broke thing. Is there an ESG backlash in practice?
Yeah. So this is something. It sort of feels like, when you have a computer that's running really slowly and there's the back end process that's making everything slow. I feel like this conversation is this like back end process in my mind that is making everything just feel a lot slower and cumbersome. I think the thing that is, up until sort of over the past couple of months, particularly since say November, December time, I sort of assumed that ESG was sort of over at least the focus on ESG and to an extent also on the sustainability space, we were staring down the barrel because that's what the media was telling us. And that's what we were hearing from left, right and center. And the headlines were only negative, especially from a political front over in the US. But what was really interesting is that a colleague of mine, a portfolio manager on the team, we went on a research trip around the UK and Europe, and we traveled to 8 countries in 8 days, 9 cities. And for the listeners, you might be happy to hear most of that was on high-speed rail. But what was really interesting is we met with these large infrastructure companies and also some of our clients on the road. And I'd never actually heard ESG being talked about so much in terms of its relevance as to where we are at today. And I think what surprised me there is that whilst there's this huge noise, the reality was not reflecting that. And the noise in the media is a big generalization as to what's going on in the US. And yes, there are ways that spills into other continents and regions and regulatory frameworks and investment strategies. But, we're not a homogenous society. We're not a homogenous economy. We're not homogenous in the way that we think and the things that we believe in and we care about. So in meeting with these companies, I just share a couple of tidbits, but we met with one of the largest electric utilities in Europe. And the CEO said to us, whilst, in the European Union, climate change is perhaps less of a priority, the focus now is about energy sovereignty and defense. But at the end of the day, the solution is the same because we need more renewables and we need more grid infrastructure. Just as much as we heard that, energy is a weapon. And again, comes back to this point around the importance of the continent decreasing its reliance on Russian gas, which is still at about 13 or 40%, which is still too high. And also in the event of a trade war, and including the energy markets. That I thought that was really interesting because we're still talking about the same solutions, but the conversation has shifted slightly in the topic. But then at the same time, on other areas such as physical risks of climate change, I've never had such in-depth and nuanced conversations with companies before about the effects of climate change on major infrastructure, critical infrastructure in the European Union and the UK. For instance, on combined sewer overflows for water utilities and managing that, and building out the necessary infrastructure to actually accommodate larger volumes at faster rates when we have these major downfall events. And then at the same time, one of the largest infrastructure companies in Europe told us that, 1 in 100-year flooding events are now 1 in 10-year events, and to upgrade the toll road infrastructure or road network across the country would cost around 70 billion euros, which is pretty astronomical when you think about it. So in short, what I suppose I'm trying to say is that these tidbits are just examples of the conversations that we had research trip, and I walked away and I realized actually how easy it is to get carried away with the noise. Yes.
One of the interesting things I had, one of the guests earlier this year, John Friedman, posted on LinkedIn a graph that showed ESG investments increased during the first Trump presidency, and where there was similar noise about sort of go broke going on in the background as well. So it is, I think you were talking, the reason why I got in touch with you were talking about the signal and the noise as well. And it sounds like the signal's still quite strong towards those ESG factors, even if the noise is clouding that. Would that be fair?
Yes, I think so. And we have to remember this noise really started about 4 or 5 months ago. And really in the inauguration of Trump and the signing of many executive orders to pull back in these areas. But, it doesn't stop overnight. Like, I think it's very easy to get stuck into this sort of like short-termist perspective. But this is longer term. Like, presidents only last for a few years. Investment capital plans run out by 10 plus years. And so the investment decisions that are being made today have to look beyond that. And we have to as investors. And I also might just say that, we can look at things like fund flows for ESG and sustainability. And yes, they have pulled back in certain markets, but they've also either increased or they've stabilized in other markets. Just as much as if you look at things like, renewable energy build-outs, it can't be year on year growth necessarily. Even a small pullback or a stabilization is fine, because the direction of travel is very, very clear. And I think you have to be living under a rock to not see the direction of travel in terms of the demand for these types of investment strategies.
Yeah, and you've talked about your, I was going to say road trip, but real trip around Europe.
Yeah.
We've already touched the US, and you're calling in from Australia. But what is there a major variation geographically in attitudes to ESG? Do you find you have to almost adjust the way you talk to different markets?
Yes, no, you do. And, I'm not saying that people who are not interested in this space, are not interesting, or I don't want to talk with them or anything, or there's anything wrong with that. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion on these things, and everyone has their own philosophy of the way that they want their money to be invested. And I completely respect that. I suppose in the UK and Europe, there's a lot more nuance in the way that you would talk about these things. The market was very fixated on emissions, for instance, in the past few years. But now there's more nuance around actually looking at energy mix planning and grid infrastructure and long duration battery storage, and actually looking a bit more at the business activities that are needed to set the world up for, the path on the energy transition. And I think that's actually a good thing, because emissions are one thing, but where the rubber hits the road is on the energy mix investment side. Over in the US, look, I think it's fair to say that the East and the West Coast are still very focused on this space, especially if you think about the Californian wildfires that were just so utterly devastating to communities all across, the Eaton fires, the Palisade fires, and so on. But also at the same time, that was really quite a a terrible market event, not only in terms of insurance and mortgages, but also investors who are investing in, say, for instance, listed companies in California that were impacted. So, I think it's fair to say in California, that is a big, big risk that's front and center, in addition to other questions around like load growth and data centers. So the increasing energy demands needed to compute algorithms and provide, satiate the world's obsession with AI. I think in the US, in other states, perhaps between the East and the West Coast, there's less of a focus. And as many will know, as you go further down south in states like Texas, there are actually, orders from judges, for instance, and legal cases and, laws that are banning things like the integration of ESG into public pension plans. So yes, you'd have to go into that market eyes wide open to recognize that that's not really a space where that's very interested, so to speak, in ESG or sustainability, full stop.
Yes. I've never really dug into how those laws actually are meant to work, because it seems bizarre. Texas, you mentioned, it has a massive fossil fuel industry, but it also, I believe, has the biggest renewable energy infrastructure in the entire US. Yeah. So, yes. How I'm never sure, particularly as the people who put forward these things always talk about it in sort of free marketeer terminology, but trying to ban one particular type of investment seems particularly bizarre, if it's profitable as it appears to be in Texas.
Yes, definitely. And actually, for some listeners and you may know, the Inflation Reduction Act was a landmark piece of legislation that passed a couple of years ago in the US. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation that provided a range of tax credits and subsidies to further catalyze energy transition investments. And of course, the purpose of that act was also to reduce inflation. And the Inflation Reduction Act has been a game changer in the US market, because as opposed to the EU, where they've hit companies over the head with regulation, in the US, they've used a carrot to incentivize. And actually, one of the biggest recipients and beneficiaries of the Inflation Reduction Act is Texas. And as you've mentioned yourself, the solar PV build-outs and wind to an extent, but certainly solar PV has just been astronomical in that state. And so whilst you may hear that, for instance, Donald Trump has threatened to rescind aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act, there is also this question that some of the deep red states will want to retain those tax credits because they benefit from them, and they also create a lot of jobs and they attract investment. So it's not as clear cut as one might think.
Yes. You've already mentioned the phrase stranded assets a couple of times, I think, which this idea that if you build, high carbon infrastructure now, what's it going to be worth in, say, 10 years' time? But presumably, and particularly in these big infrastructure projects, which you would expect to be operating for, a decade plus, several decades in many cases. How does that get folded into investment decisions? Do you have sophisticated models, or is it more of an art than a science?
Yeah, so it's I suppose relatively complex, but not to say that it's not easy to understand. It's just there's a lot to it, basically. Yeah. Basically, the way that we think about these things is there are clear parts of the energy value chain that have a shelf life. So for instance, we know that coal-fired power generation, there's currently no coal-fired power plant now in the UK. The last one was closed last year. But in countries like the US, there is still a reasonable proportion of coal-fired power generation in the electricity grid across the states. And so the reality for coal is that it is a sunset industry, it's a sunset investment. So the focus is more about the remaining life of these plants to the extent that they are still, operating efficiently. But they ideally close down, well in advance of, say, the 2035 period, because as we know, the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, have said that in order for us to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, in line with 1.5 degrees, we will need to close, or at least the coal-fired power plants will need to be retired by 2035 or thereabouts in developed economies. So, that's, whilst that is a climate scientist perspective, from the economic perspective, coal-fired power generation is expensive. There is, when you compare it to what you call the levelized cost of energy, which is sort of assuming all things being equal, between, say, renewables and coal. Renewables is just so much cheaper. And whilst there are higher upfront costs to invest in them, there are no input costs, there's no commodity cost. And also at the same time with coal, they become incredibly inefficient over time. So in short, what I'm trying to say is that the Trump administration has indicated that it is developing a sort of framework to help incentivize investments into what you call greenfield or new coal-fired power plants in the United States. Having spoken with electric utilities in the US and asked them about this, they have outright just said there's no way that they would do that.
Yeah.
Forget about the environmental implications. It would make no economic sense to do that. In terms of the stranded asset risk that they may face, it's not worth it. Equally, at the same time, there has been discussions, or at least announcements, so to speak, from US politicians around trying to incentivize more pipeline projects as well, so oil and gas pipelines, particularly oil, or to at least what you would refer to as sort of restarting mothballed projects, so projects that were previously closed down, but government is looking at ways that they can be restarted. And again, having spoken with some pipeline companies about this, they just, depending on the type of project, their response is always just like, there's absolutely no way that we would do that, because the hurdles of actually getting these projects across the line are so high and cumbersome now that it's not worth it, and there's too much uncertainty on the other side. So I think that's really interesting, because what really matters is actually what the companies are saying. It's not necessarily what the politicians are saying. But in terms of your question around how we account for this, what we do is we look at things like climate change scenarios. So the International Energy Agency, which is like, a peak body that aggregates energy market data and policy data from around the world every year, they release a set of scenarios every year that look at different rates of the energy transition. And what we do on the team is we look at what the evaluation impact would be for the companies in our portfolio relative to different stages of the energy transition. So assuming that what was announced was enacted and enshrined in law, and then a net zero sort of scenario, so a more accelerated scenario. And what we found is that the greatest beneficiaries are, of course, low carbon transport, so railroads, so like things like Eurostar and the Eurotunnel, and then also things like obviously renewable energy development, but at the same time electric utilities, because they can also own regulated, they can also invest in renewable energy and transmission and grid infrastructure. The biggest risks are around at the energy storage and pipeline companies, because of course the future, for instance, for oil is challenged, especially in light of the growth of EVs, and the rate at which battery technology is changing and cheap manufacturing out from China. So we also do assess other things, just quickly around this off. We look at things like terminal values. So the The terminal value is basically the value of an asset or a business beyond the forecasted period that when the future cash flows can be estimated. In short, it's just a way of having a view as to what the value will be of the asset. And we have, we assess that for some of these companies. We might assess them downwards if we think there's potential stranded asset risk there. So anyway, it's just a few examples of the way that we think on these things.
It was interesting because, again, I apart from some really tiny sort of hobby investments that I make once in a while, I don't have the view that you have. So it's very interesting to hear that stranded assets not just sort of a theory talked about in green circles. It sounds like it's actively being factored into investment decisions. Those sort of low carbon scenarios.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I can think of examples of stranded assets. I might just add that this is not investment advice.
Actually, I was thinking of saying that at the start, is that this is a theoretical discussion about the ESG.
These are not investment
investments can go up as well as down.
Recommendations whatsoever.
Yeah.
Yes. So I suppose just on that, yes, it's I can give you examples of stranded assets, but I won't, just for the sake of that would involve obviously naming companies.
Yeah.
But I can assure you and others on this call that there is such a thing, and it is a recognised thing in the way that investors might value assets, or at least those who are more ESG minded.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. The other interesting thing when you talked about the US and coal, of course, Donald Trump, he wasn't saying drill baby drill the first time he got elected, but I remember him with the miner's helmet on pretending to dig in a way that I've only ever seen people digging sandcastles on a beach. But coal investment and coal output actually fell during the first Trump presidency as well. So, I think most people in the sustainability world were, shall we say, very concerned when Trump got reelected. But the statistics suggest that certainly his bark may be much worse than his bite when it comes to actually implementing these policies. And of course,
yes, and we should never. Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right. I was just going to say the infrastructure that you're talking about doesn't appear overnight either. It's got...
no, it doesn't. And
yeah.
Well, I was just going to... sorry. I think, and I agree with you about the bark versus bite, but I think we should never underestimate the invisible power of the visible hand of the market.
Yeah.
And whilst we can have this noise and rhetoric, the market might be doing a completely different thing, and that's the interesting bit.
Absolutely. My next question was the bit where I was going to say nothing in this call is investment advice, and investments go down as well as up, et cetera, and all those caveats. But if you had a crystal ball time, how do you see the ESG market evolving over the next decade?
Yeah, so this is just my personal perspective, but I think, I do think this sort of where we are seeing some backtracking, I do think it's a healthy recalibration, because there's a hell of a lot of greenwashing out there. And that's not useful to the market. It's misleading. It's misleading for investors, customers, mums and dads, consumers, and alike. We don't want greenwashing. It's useless, and it actually detracts from the purpose of the ESG integration process and goals around climate change and sustainability. So my hope is that in the sort of pullback that we are seeing in certain markets, and sort of some of these larger corporates pulling messaging on ESG, my hope is that we start to sort of, we start to see more genuine action and demonstrable action over time, and less sort of like marketing fluff, so to speak. Yeah. I do think, though, what will be really interesting is what happens on the energy sovereignty and security front, particularly in Europe and the UK, because the energy markets have been significantly underinvested in for decades. And we're now at this sort of precipice of major investment, but also the opportunity to increase independence of the continent and the UK as well, but then creating connectivity through grids. So I think this will be a really interesting point, or at least juncture that we've reached, and that I think I personally think this is a theme that will play out for decades to come. As much as with the data center and the AI piece, because of the energy needs there, especially over in the US, it will be interesting to see what happens, because as new technologies are released around sort of, these AI models like ChatGPT, for instance, if more and more release that are more efficient and require less energy, then we might actually see some of this anticipated load growth on the electricity grid isn't as big as we thought. But again, we just don't know what that will look like. The other thing I just quickly say is that because unfortunately we are not on course to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we are likely to see, I think it's fair to say, more extreme and frequent weather events, and with that, huge investment needs in climate adaptation and resilience, because there are parts of the world that will soon become uninhabitable, as we have seen in the case of California. Overnight, whole communities can be completely decimated. Yeah. So yes, I suppose in short, those are the three areas. Not to mention, of course, technological breakthroughs. So perhaps we might see more developments with long duration storage battery. So battery storage for large electricity grids that are able to store energy beyond the 3-hour mark. And I feel confident that we will see that in the next decade, or at least that's my hope.
Do you think there's scope for ESG just become normal, so there's no such thing as an ESG investment, it's just an investment?
Yes, I mean, it's possible. Like I said earlier, it's inherent, at least on the team that I work in, it's inherent in everything we do. And we don't really label things as like ESG data, because environmental fines and sewage overspows for water utilities could be labeled E, but these are also financial markers, which are, which can actually create more risk with those companies, and of course subpar environmental and customer outcomes. So yes, there may be a doing away with the term, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think there is purpose in being explicit about it, because at the end of the day, you would hope that there are ultimate goals that are being worked towards, for instance, to minimize the effects of climate change, or to limit global warming, or to build out, clean energy investments. But maybe we will do away with it. I don't know. Maybe I'll be without a job in 10 years.
No, well, the opposite is that those skills would be standard skills rather than specialist skills.
Yes, I suppose. Yes, and that would be ideal, because then everyone owns it, and that's something that from the team that I work with, everyone owns it. But I think there's something to be said for consistency and repeatability in what you do, and I think for me at least that's where my role is to ensure that what we're doing is consistent, and we're not working in a contradictory way, and that the outcomes that we're looking for we're all on the same page with. So I do think there is a role, but maybe over time it will become less explicit. Yes,
it'll become the only signal. It will become definitely the signal, and there'll be virtually no noise distracting from it. Ideally.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Georgia. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, and I've learned an awful lot about the ESG world, and in particular in major infrastructure projects. So thank you for joining us this morning for me, evening for you.
Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And sorry again about my interjections. I just got really excited in the conversation.
We like enthusiastic people. That's no problem at all. Thank you, George.
Thank you.